allows us to do the other part of our business, which is to share those learnings with you and with others based on what we've learned, so that you can build your capabilities to impact what happens inside of your organization. And we do that through some events like this, and we also do that inside of organizations through some of our proprietary training and tool transfer activities. Now, a lot of the stories and things that we gain and share with others come from organizations that we have the chance to read about, that we sometimes work with, and that are oftentimes in the press. And so today we'll be sharing some stories from these and other organizations that will enlighten our discussion as we talk a little bit more about business models. Now, before I get too much further into today's topic, I wanted to sort of set the stage by talking a little bit about a phenomenon that I think all of us have probably begun to see or experience. And I think this quote from Charles Schwab sort of sums it up really well. He was quoted as saying, "We brought prices down, down, down. So they are now essentially commodities. So if we want to succeed in this business, we have to move in a direction of adding other value to the relationship with our clients." And so where I might have said 15 years ago, we want to be the best discount brokerage, today, I want to be the best relationship company in financial services. Now, whether we know much about Charles Schwab and that business or not, they were a leader for a time in being a discount brokerage to help people with their financial decisions and making trades and buying financial products and so forth. But over time, they got to be known as being one of the most helpful and friendly organizations online in helping customers do this. And what I find interesting about this quote is, here you have a founder of an organization who is highlighting in a pretty substantial way the fact that over time, what made an organization distinctive and special changes. And what made you a winner in the past may not allow you to continue to win in the same way going forward. And so as we start our conversation and we start to think about this issue of competition, what this really reiterated for me is the fact that competition is getting more competitive. And what used to set us apart and distinguish us no longer may do so in some cases. Now, there's an organization that I have the privilege to be working with, and our organization is doing some work with right now. They're a leader around the world in their particular space. They've made some of the best products in their particular niche, and they've done a tremendous job in selling that across the world, and now they have a very substantial install base worldwide for their particular products and some of the services that go with it. But what they're realizing is that the growth potential and the opportunity to differentiate their organization is starting to be much like Charles Schwab described. Things are commoditizing. The products that were so innovative and great 10 or 15 years ago are now sort of run-of-the-mill. They're good, they're solid, and so forth, but competitors can offer things that are equally as good. And so now it's becoming a little bit of a food fight, trying to sell some more products and continue to maintain a market leadership position by selling more products and services. So to this company's credit, what they've done is they've stepped back and they've said, what is really the problem that our customer is trying to solve for? And what they've realized is that the customer does need a product to fulfill certain needs in their businesses. This is a business-to-business company. But more importantly than just having the product, this customer needs access to data about how the product is helping them do their business. They need systems that allow them to diagnose and to provide different services. They need a way to, frankly, just run their business a little bit differently and provide more value added. And this company that's been selling products for years is saying to themselves, if that's what our customers really need, how are we going to do that? And this is what, for me, spurred an interest in this topic. I think we're seeing it written about in a lot of different places. Earlier this year, there was a great article in the Harvard Business Review about platforms, pipelines, and strategy. And I think what it's bringing forward is the fact that one of the great ways or the best ways to differentiate right now is in building out a platform. And we're going to talk a bit about what that is, but this client of ours that's working on this is starting to realize, you know, we've got products, we've got services, but that's not enough. We need to build a platform that really helps answer some of the questions that our customers have around the systems and the data and the information about their customers. And if we can't do that, somebody else will come in and fill that need. And so they're having to pivot from being a product leader to really becoming the innovator and the creator of a platform that will bring new value to their customers. So where are we going to go today? There's three primary areas that we'd like to touch on. These are sort of, for me, the keys for designing a differentiated business model. The first one is to talk about rethinking what products and services mean to customers and to providers. Secondly, orchestrating a value-added platform for customers and providers and how to go about doing that. And thirdly, how to then build out a platform ecosystem that enhances the stickiness of and value for customers. Now, on the surface, those keys might seem cryptic, or they may not seem like they're particularly action-oriented. But as we go into each of these, hopefully you'll walk away with some ideas that will spur some thinking, that will prompt questions that you might ask to leaders in your organization, or that will prompt you in how you facilitate certain discussions with business leaders. And if you are an executive and you're trying to think about these competitive issues, hopefully it will give you some ideas of how you can take the capabilities and strength of your business and start to pivot it in a way that will bring added value for your business and allow you to step out from the competitive crowd and differentiate. So let's dive into the first of these, rethinking what products and services mean to customers and providers. If you search Google, you can find all sorts of crazy things, and I came across this little picture that suggests that what more could a person want than a bacon-flavored Diet Coke. I know that everyone's been out there craving this, and you'll be pleased to know that this will soon be on a store shelf near you. But the premise here is that when we start to think about what value is to a customer, we sometimes think we take our base product that has been so successful and we just start adding more and more features and dimensions to it. The reality is it's a little bit more complex than that, and it's a little bit more nuanced than that. In fact, we often have to ask the customer, what are you trying to accomplish? What is the job that you need to have done? And how can we rethink the way we help you solve that or meet that job? Now, when we think about a traditional business model, often they're defined by a set of products or services that are delivered or created and delivered to the customer. There's very distinct inputs, things that happen inside the organization to produce very definitive outputs. There's usually physical infrastructure. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's usually a plant, or there's a distribution mechanism, or there's a retail store, or something like that. It's typically reasonably sequential or linear in the way that it happens. We take an input, put it into the plant, we go through our steps of refinement, we create value, and then we turn around and ship it to a customer. So it's a fairly linear, sequential process. There are customers and providers, and they're usually connected through the value add that your organization does by manufacturing something, by marketing something, by stocking or selling something. And the value is created through the process that an organization performs that connects the customer and the provider together. And over time, the customer's loyalty is secured really through the product or service that you deliver and that is unique from what others are looking for. Now, that's sort of the traditional business model. Nothing wrong with that. The problem is that when you're like Charles Schwab and your business over time starts to commoditize, you start to run out of opportunities and options, frankly, for continuing to differentiate. So in contrast, we start to hear, and we have been hearing a lot about the idea of a platform business model. Now, how different is this from things that we are already familiar with? Well, there are a lot of platforms out there, and we probably are quite familiar with some of them already. Basically, a platform, let me start with a description here. A platform really tends to gain its value by facilitating the exchange of information or facilitating interactions. Some platforms, in fact, don't even have a product per se. They're just facilitating the exchange of information or people getting together and exchanging something of value. The attributes of the platform tend to be fairly configurable. They can change, they can morph over time, whereas once you've built a factory or once you've built a retail store, you have less flexibility to move things around as the needs of customers change. And in a platform, there is a little bit more ability sometimes to configure or reconfigure things to meet evolving needs. Often it is digital. And when we say digital, there's multiple or many different channels through which the value can be disseminated or created. It's multidimensional, which means it doesn't just start in one place and sequentially move through a series of steps to end in a customer's possession. It's something that can be initiated sometimes by a customer or sometimes by someone who's trying to provide value. And there's certainly value that's coming not only through the process, but through the network effects, meaning that as more and more people participate on the platform, more value is created. And finally, this idea of customer retention sort of shifts to how do I make the platform and the experience so sticky that people want to stay and participate. So these are some of the rough characteristics. And let me use a very simple example to kind of illustrate this, and then we can start to talk of some more common examples in the world today. In a very basic way, a retail store is a traditional business model. Somebody puts a shingle out and says, I'm selling some set of products, and people come to the store and buy them. That's a fairly simple, basic, traditional business model. A platform business model, using an equally simple example, is like a shopping mall. Instead of there just being one store, there's an entire mall full of stores that facilitate exchanges among different providers, and a customer can come in and can browse multiple stores with multiple options, and sometimes there's even competitors in the same mall that I could buy clothing from one store versus another store. But the great thing about the mall is you get the added value of the network effects. I can go to one location, I can purchase lots of things, and in some respects I may even pick up purchases if I'm a retailer in a mall, sales that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise simply because someone was walking down the hall and they decided to buy something on the spur of the moment that they wouldn't have normally purchased. And that's the great thing about being in a shopping mall. There's convenience for all, there's the network effects, and the more compelling the offerings there, the more people will go to a mall to shop. Now, I'm not making a case for why shopping malls should stay in our suburban neighborhoods and so forth, but I am suggesting that in a very simple way, a single retail store is a traditional business model. A shopping mall is a very basic form of a business platform. And we see this in a lot of different companies that we're probably familiar with. If we went to a very extreme example, or a common example, a traditional business model might be a Macy's, who is obviously working to transform its business to become omni-channel, and it's competing against a business like Amazon.com, which was very much formed as a platform business to start with. So with those kind of fundamental differences understood, we go back to the question, what's different about this? And perhaps the biggest difference about it is the fact that the platform creates a place, a marketplace, digital or physical, where both customers, consumers, and providers of value can come together to meet. Sometimes it can just simply be there's lots of them and they find ways to meet there. Other times the platform itself creates a process whereby consumers and providers can exchange value. Uber is a great example of a platform business model. Airbnb is another great example of a platform business model. You know, Airbnb has no hotel rooms. It has no property, but it has, and it is, the greatest number of rooms available for its customers of any business out there, more than a Marriott, more than a Hilton, simply by facilitating people who have space meeting up with people who need to rent a place to stay. So the way that we think about value changes considerably when we start to think about the platform. Now, once we start to understand the idea of a platform, the question is, how do we create a platform that adds value and that really is more than just a meeting place? And so there's a couple of questions that I think prompt some thought around this that I'd like to put forward. And there's some great examples of companies out there that have clearly thought about these questions and worked to build or design their business models to meet these. The first question that I think really drives a successful platform business model is understanding the problems that participants are trying to solve. And notice I've shifted here to talk about participants rather than just customers. Normally when we position a question talking about strategy, we say, well, what does our customer want? It's a great question. But when you're talking about a platform business model, you often have to think about, well, what are the problems the participants are trying to solve for? If I use LinkedIn as an example here, they obviously have a bunch of people, professionals usually, who are wanting to meet and connect for a variety of reasons, to find jobs, to share information, to make connections, and so forth. And then you have providers who are also trying to do business using LinkedIn because they need to find candidates or they want to find talent that can help them perform certain work. So the platform really solves a problem for both parties, both the customer and the provider, not just for the customer. And in reality, in this case, LinkedIn isn't solving the problem for the customer or the provider. It's simply facilitating a means for the customer to find the provider or for the provider to find the customer. And they have many mechanisms inside of the platform to help facilitate that. The second question that really helps drive thinking around the creation of the platform is, what information do the participants, again, both customers and providers, need to make good decisions? Amazon has been great at helping lead this by providing ways for users to share feedback about not only their platform, but the products that are sold and exchanged on the Amazon platform. That information can really inform the way people act. Something as simple as, if you buy this product, it's common for people that buy this to buy this other product with it. And that can drive additional sales. The network effects come into play because with that information, a consumer can make more decisions. It could also help a provider who's selling one of those products to realize, you know, Amazon is suggesting that a customer buy this other product with my product. Perhaps that's an opportunity to look for a partnership or to add that bundled product to their own product offerings. That information gives great value to the participants in the process. The next key question is, what interactions will participants really find valuable and what will they pay for? There's a lot of connections that can be facilitated through social media and other things, but those platforms have to figure out how are they going to create value that people will ultimately be willing to pay for. The transformation we've seen in a lot of the social media platforms like Facebook and others has really been trying to search this question out. At first, it was great to simply create a meeting place where millions of people could come, share information, find friends, make connections. That was great. But if you want to be a viable business, you have to find a way for that platform and those connections to create something of value. And so over the years, we've seen Facebook and others try to find ways that they can monetize the value that is created through those interactions. In a similar way, your business might have a lot of interactions or connections or customers or whatnot that could find value by connecting with others. But will they pay for that? Or will that just simply be a nice-to-have feature? The next question is, what's going to be perceived by the participants as being truly distinctive? Is it going to be something that I'm willing to pay a premium for? Is it something that I'm willing to eschew other options to come specifically to your platform for? Is it easier to use? Are there distinctive products? Is it more safe? Are there more people I can interact with? Is there more diversity? And a variety of different questions that would allow your platform to be distinctive. We use Apple here as one illustration of distinctiveness because they have, sometimes to some degree of ridicule, kept their platform fairly closed. They're fairly clear on what kinds of participants can add apps to their ecosystem. They have fairly strict requirements for providers to provide different kinds of accessories like cases or cords or things like that. They put those rules out there so that if the products that are available through Apple that create the Apple ecosystem of iCloud, of payments, of watches, of phones, of computers, and so forth, that it all sort of works together and it delivers a reinforcing value of the simplicity, the sophistication of the Apple offering overall. And so people choose to be a part of that because of its simplicity and its quality and its connectivity, whereas other platforms might offer similar advantages but be less distinctive or not be as premium in the way they look at that. And then the last question I wanted to raise was just simply what controls are needed to ensure the quality, safety, and fairness of the platform. And so I think Uber's an example of this, where they, over the last few years, have had to deal with not only a lot of backlash in certain cities where they've tried to open business, but how do they ensure that the quality of the offering is good? Well, they let riders rate drivers, and they let drivers rate riders. They've had to do some things to ensure that the people working for them are, qualified. They'll deliver some degree of safety. And they've had to make sure that the app provides a fair exchange of value, that it doesn't benefit one small group or person over another. So these are some of the questions that when you're starting to look at a business model platform, you really have to start to take into account so that you can drive uniqueness and differentiation. Now, before I move on, there's a great question here I'd like to pause for a moment and respond to. It's easy, and I'm going to frame this by sort of taking in context of the examples I've used here. It's easy to look at these questions I've laid out in light of these companies because a lot of these companies are new companies. They've been created within, the last few years or couple of decades. What if I work in a company that's been around for many decades, even a century or longer? How do I transform from being a more traditional business model of making and distributing a product to creating more of a platform-type business model? That's a great question, and it's probably not a simple answer. I think that's really kind of the intent of the entire discussion we're having today, is to provide some ways for leaders to think about the aspects that create value today. Apple, for example, as late as maybe 10 years ago, was simply a producer of hardware and maybe a few software products as well. And so even though they're still very young, I would say, as a company compared to companies that have been around for a century or more, they did start off with a fairly traditional business model. Customer need, build a product, improve that product, create value, differentiation around that product, and get loyal customers to follow after you. But what they started to realize is that they were never going to become the biggest manufacturer of computers. So they decided, well, there's some other opportunities we have to create value here, and they began to create, probably under the visionary leadership of Steve Jobs, to think about their business differently beyond just a manufacturing of a product. They started to ask themselves, what are the problems our customers are really trying to solve for? You could argue that perhaps what they tried to do was use design thinking. They started to say, well, if I need to understand the problem my customer's trying to solve, what can I put into my organization that would help solve for this? And that's where you start to see the emergence of things like iTunes, which was not a product per se or a hardware device, but it led to a hardware device. And what Apple realized is that device, which they created, the iPod, needed a mechanism in order to provide the kind of listening experience, music experience, that a consumer of that device would like to have. And the reason that those kind of devices, which frankly had been invented by other companies, really took off is because Apple not only created that device, they created iTunes to go with it. And so because of that, they really started to create a much broader ecosystem of offerings. And so you could argue to some extent that they maybe stumbled into this over time, but now they really think thoughtfully about where do their devices fit into the broader ecosystem and platform of the Apple business. And so my question, maybe back to this question that's been asked, is if you take the products you've been making for 100 years or more and you start to ask yourself the question, what are the problems that your customers are really trying to solve now? And expand that. What are the people that provide answers to your customers? Not just your product, but all of the providers that provide answers to your customers. What are they trying to provide? What information do your customers need to make good buying decisions? What interactions with your company and with other providers would your customers find valuable and be willing to pay for? And I think through answering some of these questions that are right here on this page, you can begin to explore new possibilities. It will not be an easy transition if you've been a 100-year-old manufacturer, for example. But I do believe it's possible with the right questions to begin to explore new ways. And once you do that, that's a perfect segue into sort of our last key for today's discussion, which is, okay, if I've now started to envision a different way of going to market and bringing value to my customer, I'm actually getting ahead of myself. How do I build an organization to do that? And so in a minute, we'll talk about how do you begin to change and transform your organization to do that. Before going there, I was just reminded as I flipped ahead, there are a couple of risks that you do have to look out for when you're building out a platform. And I don't want to gloss over this because I think these risks are important to keep in mind. The first one is just simply noise. A platform invites lots of participants. It might be like on the Uber platform, many, many drivers and many, many consumers. How do you make sure that the noise does not get in the way? Same thing with, an app store. Great thing about the Apple App Store, you can find anything in it. The great thing about the Android apps and so forth, and there's even more of those than there are on Apple, there's just too many of them. So how do you make sure that the noise and the volume does not drown out the differentiation that you're trying to bring? The second one is you have to be mindful that there's going to be some new and unexpected competitors. So in this simple example, you have some very long, well-established providers of different kinds of products and services, and now because of a platform type of business model that has emerged, you have a new, brand new competitor that probably 8 or 10 years ago was not even on the minds of a Siemens or a Honeywell, but now is becoming a potential competitor. And that's going to happen as you create a platform that's easy for providers and consumers to participate in. It's going to be easy for new people to create an opportunity that might compete against you. You have to watch out for changes in the platform rules. If I was an app and I was trying to be found in an app store, if someone changes the search criteria, I might never be found again, or I might get relegated down the list quite a ways. Platforms control a lot of the transaction costs of matching providers and customers, so how do you make sure that those are managed? And then lastly, as regulations start to come into the platform, how do you make sure that those standards are things that you can address and can design into your organization? Next risk, naturally, participants, whether it be the provider or the customer, have negative feedback. And that can really shape the way that people exchange value and make buying decisions. I know personally when I go onto Amazon and I'm looking for something and I see a lot of options come forward, if I see a low-rated product, I'll sometimes skip over that because I trust that there must be an issue there that would steer me away from it. And if that were to be unfairly provided to a particular product, then they're losing business because of that feedback. Similar to the Siemens, Honeywell, and Nest example, there are new platforms and there are competitive platforms. And so, where users choose to be will shape where providers and customers choose to put their energy. If I have an app and I've decided to put it on the Android platform, do I ignore the Apple and Microsoft platforms, or do I have to now put my business on all three of them? So there's additional cost to try to be in all of the relevant platforms. And then lastly, the platform can do things to change access to certain customers by providing premium membership levels and things like that. And that can affect your business if you're not willing to participate in the new pricing schemes that a platform puts out there. So probably more discussion to be had on all of these risks, but these are some of the things that are perhaps unique to a business that's designing around the platform. Now, as I promised a minute ago, we were going to get to this topic of how do you now go about building out a platform. And the tagline for me is not just build it, but how do you build it in a way that will attract people to it and keep them there once they come? I was in a meeting just the other day, and a colleague of mine had to leave to go to the airport. He pulled up his phone. He started to search on Uber for a car. And the great thing about Uber is one of the things it gives you is an estimated cost. And as he was looking at the cost of what it was going to take to get to his destination, he thought to himself, and he literally said it out loud in the meeting, he said, wow, this is going to be expensive. And then he turned to the group after he'd interrupted the meeting. He said, does anybody know what some of those other ride-sharing apps are? And some people threw some names out, and he quickly downloaded one of the apps and opened it up, and he did a search on that app, and he said, oh, wow, it's about half the price. Now, that was a lot of work to switch, but in that moment, in just a few minutes, one of the participants in the Uber application or platform made a choice to switch applications because of a pricing issue. And so the question of competitiveness is ultimately going to attack the platforms that are out there. And so the question of how do you build one that's sticky, that really continues to add value over time, and that will cause people to stay involved and stay active in it. Now, to tee off this discussion, I do want to bring forward our book, Mastering the Cube. For those that are familiar with it, the basic premise of this book is that when you think about an organization, think about it like a Rubik's Cube. Organizations have multiple dimensions. And think about the sides of the Rubik's Cube representing different dimensions of the organization, how we do our work, how we're structured, how we measure and count things, the people and talent that we have, our culture, and so forth. And each side represents a dimension of the organization. I don't get credit if I solve the Rubik's Cube and only get the blue side lined up. I still have 5 other sides that are a jumbled mess. So to really solve an organizational puzzle, you can't just solve one dimension of it. I can't just have great work processes and then leave the jobs and structure, undefined, or, leave the metrics following traditional measures that wouldn't align to what my strategy is. You really have to line up all the dimensions of the organization to essentially solve the organizational cube. Now that mentality is particularly important as you start to think about a platform business model, and per the question that came up earlier, if I'm transitioning from a traditional business model, one where I made a product, let's say, and I'm transitioning now to a platform of some sort, I can't just solve the blue side. I have to be willing to look at all of the choices my organization makes and try to realign them. So let me be more precise now. If I want to go from sort of a jumbled mess to an aligned organization, I have to think through the work that the organization needs to do. I have to think through the structure and governance dimensions of the organization. I have to think through the information metrics, the people and rewards, how I keep the organization renewed and refreshed through continuous improvement, and then what's the right leadership and culture to help pull all of this together. Now, what I like about this image here is that on the top picture of the Rubik's Cube, I see an organization that's clearly not aligned. And I look at the one at the bottom, one that's perfectly aligned. Now, if I'm an organization that today has been a very successful organization for a long period of time, making and selling a product or a set of services, I'm probably like the Rubik's Cube at the bottom, well aligned. But here's the problem. If I'm well aligned in a market that's commoditizing, or that's no longer growing, or that's no longer differentiating, then I may have to think about my organization as being more like the one at the top. Now, that may seem odd because we often say organizations are perfectly designed to get the results they're getting. But if the real needs of the customer and the providers are different than what my organization is set up and aligned to do, in reality, I'm dealing with a misaligned cube, one that's all jumbled up. And so ultimately, to realign it and get it back into a complete, perfectly aligned organization, I'm going to have to start to re-examine all of these dimensions of the organization, the work, the structure, the information, the people and talent, and so forth, and do so in alignment with where my strategy is going. I started off our discussion today by sharing one of my clients who is moving from being a product-based business with some services to becoming and building a platform to meet some needs that the customer has that currently are not being met. I really commend them for doing this. And here's the interesting thing, is they've gotten into the hard work of realigning the aspects of the organization. They don't view their organization anymore as perfectly aligned. They view it as jumbled up. Even though they're a very successful company, they're a world leader in the products and services that they offer, as they're architecting their organization, they're realizing it is not designed to deliver a platform. And if that is going to be the mechanism that's going to help us win and compete, we have to treat it as a misaligned whole. So the takeaway for me here is that if resources or activities aren't going to differ from your competitor, then just adding some features like, a platform might have, like user ratings or something like that, that's not going to drive sustainable value. The sustainable value really comes as you start to build out an entire ecosystem of organizational choices that are going to drive and reinforce that. And that's the thing that's going to become distinctive over time, is not the features that your platform have, or not even the fact that you've created a platform where you can bring users and providers together to create interactions, exchange of information, and benefit from the network effects. It's going to come from the distinctiveness of how your organization is set up to actually do that. When I look at Uber right now, frankly, I love it. It's very convenient as a user. The pricing on it, yeah, it fluctuates and all of that. There's some quirks about it that could be better. But I think the strategic challenge that that organization has in the coming years is to figure out, is its organization going to allow itself to differentiate? The app, the platform, and all of that are ultimately easy to copy by others. And just like I illustrated from my colleague who was in a meeting the other day and decided to flip to a different platform to get his ride to the airport, I believe Uber is going to have to solve for that, not by just coming up with new features, because someone else will copy those new features very quickly. They're going to have to design into their choices of their organization very unique ways of doing things. Let me give an illustration here to show how this might play out. I'm going to use Apple as an example. They're well published, so most of us will be able to relate. The stickiness and value of Apple, to some extent, is designed into it, not just as a product, but in how they do their business. And let me give some examples. For example, and this is not all inclusive, by the way, but just enough to give an illustration. When I look at their retail stores, for example, they have a distinctive store design. Even that's probably pretty easy to copy. But when you couple that with engineering that happens concurrently across divisions, a memorable product unwrap experience, which is by design, and you couple that with a governance structure that includes extensive meetings without formal presentations, a way that people share and collaborate in a fairly agile way, that there's no divisions with different P&L targets. Everything sort of rolls up to the very top, and they work across that in terms of how they get things done. They have collaborative hiring around top talent. Apple University is about transmitting company knowledge. They've got a very large app marketplace that has rules and standards built around it. And it's an organization that's pretty ruthless about making trade-offs. I know that I've just ordered a new computer, and I'm very frustrated by the fact that I've lost all of my ports for the different devices I need to connect to my computer. But they make those trade-offs because they're trying to bring new capabilities and thinking, and I have to, as a consumer, live with that. But that design thinking permeates the company. Now, you might look at these choices as just being sort of random. These choices are not random. These are intentional choices that make it hard for anyone to come along and completely copy anything that Apple does. They may come out with a phone that looks very similar to the iPhone, that has similar capabilities, may even have some new things that the iPhone doesn't even have. But it's so very difficult to replicate the entirety of the Apple ecosystem because of the way they've designed it into the way they work. And this is what I believe over time an Airbnb, an Uber, a LinkedIn, and others are going to have to ultimately get down and build, is distinctive organizational choices and capabilities if they want to get there. So those are sort of the three big ideas that I wanted to cover today. And what I'd like to do before we wind down is pose a couple of questions for the listeners to consider. One, do you understand the difference between a platform business model and a more traditional business model? And I'd ask you to consider, in light of where you work today, in light of the organization you're leading today, what are the pros and cons of one or the other? Second question, as you look at your organization, how could your business be transformed to take advantage of the good things that a platform business model brings to the table? And thirdly, do you or your organization have the tools and methods needed to redesign your business model and your organization to truly create something distinctive, a formula, if you will, inside, embedded into the actual DNA of the organization that would allow you to differentiate and win if you do that? I'm going to go back to my client again as you're thinking about these things and suggest my client who's trying to make this transition from product to platform, they don't have the tools inside, but they're open to taking the time it takes to think it through. They're asking the tough questions. They're moving resources in the company from areas that used to be very important and essential to the business's strategy and moving them out of those areas into new areas. One of the things that they've always done is they've designed some software, but mostly software to run their products. Now they're setting up software groups that are completely designing an experience and systems and ways for customers to exchange information on a platform, a digital platform, frankly, that never existed before, that isn't embedded in a single product, but really cuts across the entirety of their product platform. That's the kind of stuff that we see companies doing to try to make this transition from pipeline business model to platform business model. That covers the content that we wanted to cover today. As always, before we conclude a webinar of this sort, we want to bring to your attention and make exclusively available to you a new executive guide that's fresh off the press. It's called Designing and Implementing a Successful Matrix Organization. Many organizations out there, due to their complexity, are designing matrix and or have matrix organizations that may or may not work the way they want to. And so we've tried to distill a lot of our lessons learned from working inside of these organizations and make them available to people so that they can start to design their organizations around a matrix more successfully. And this is going to become available to you following our session today. Before we close things down and I turn it back to Vonnie for her to give you any final last-minute instructions about how you can get access to this guide, how you can download today's webinar, are there any final questions that participants have that you want to ask? Okay, I don't think we see any other questions coming through. So rather than keep you, we're going to go ahead and wind things down. I'm going to turn it back to Vonnie if you want to make any closing logistical comments.
Okay, just want to let you know that early next week you'll receive an email with a link to today's recording as well as the slides from our presentation. And also we'll have a link for you to be able to download this new executive guide as well. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Thanks.